All right, so I hope everybody is doing all right here on this Friday night. As I'm sitting here recording this live, we're looking at the late slate of games. It looks like we got all four games about to be going on, and we're going to be now breaking down the Saturday slate here in this episode. So, the Saturday slate and the Sunday slate, they're a little less crazy than the Thursday and Friday slates. But we still got a full jam-packed 8-game slate to get to. So here in this episode, we are going to break down every game. We are going to give you all the information that you're going to need to know to build some winning DFS lineups for the Saturday slate. And we are going to do that all in probably about 40 to 45 minutes. So it should be a pretty efficient show here today with it only being an 8-game slate. Now, a few announcements for this upcoming schedule for the show here. So tomorrow night, we will not be doing a show for the Sunday slate. And that is because it's actually for a good reason. I'm going to be going to Charlotte to watch North Carolina, Michigan State, as well as Texas versus Tennessee. You all know my team, Texas Longhorns, still in it. So, going to be going to Charlotte to watch that game live, and I probably won't be getting back home till about midnight. So just probably gonna not have an episode for the Sunday slate for that reason. But what I am going to do is I am going to have my full game notes available in the Fantasy Corner Discord. So if you don't know what the Fantasy Corner Discord is, it is a Discord, a community with a lot of smart people, a lot of good people who know a lot about college basketball DFS. And the chat has been absolutely jumping this week with March Madness going on. And so if you're looking for people to talk about DFS with or, just sweat it out with and enjoy being part of a community, go join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube. And if you need help finding that, let me know because I've definitely helped some people with that as well. But I'm going to have my full game notes for the Sunday slate in there. So if you want to know pretty much all of my thoughts on the Sunday slate, or if you want to ask me a question directly or talk about anybody I'm playing, Fantasy Corner Discord is the place you can go for that Sunday slate. But I will not be having a full-fledged episode for it. We will pick up next week. I'm going to see what the NIT schedule looks like before figuring out what days I'm going to end up recording. But I'm definitely going to have a show for Thursday and Friday for the Sweet 16, and then Saturday and Sunday for the Elite 8. Those are going to be a little bit smaller slates, so they're going to be a little bit shorter shows, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail and really try to nail down some of the guys and some of the plays on that slate, because it's a drastically different game theory game when you're playing a 4 or 2 game slate versus playing a 16 game slate like we had the past 2 days. So anyway, we've got 8 games ahead of us for this Saturday. So let's go ahead and dive into it now. If you have any questions, anybody you want to ask me about, anybody you want me to talk up, put it in the chat. I am here for you guys. I am just going to try to get out all this information to you guys in the most efficient way possible. So, if something gets glossed over, if you want to know more about something, let me know in the chat so that way I can get to it. And I'll make sure to give you guys what you need to build winning lineups for Saturday, because I don't know about y'all, but it's been kind of an up and down first 2 days for me. Had some really good success on the early slates Thursday, like the afternoon slate. But then the night slate on Thursday caught up to me, and it knocked some of my survivor entries out. Just didn't play enough of the value Sanford guys, even though I love the value Sanford guys. I didn't realize they were going to be as chalky as they were. And so actually, as much as I liked them, I ended up being a little bit underweight to the field, even though they were some of my most popular plays. So a little bit of a weird slate Thursday, but Friday has been pretty good so far. Definitely going to be sweating it out on this TCU Utah State game. I've got a lot of guys going in that one, so we'll see how that goes. All right. Anyway, let's go ahead and get rolling here, and we are going to break down the Saturday slate with game number 1. And game number 1 is going to be between the Dayton Flyers and the Arizona Wildcats. So quick story. So my dad, who you guys, if you watch the bracket breakdown show, saw on here, which he actually had a lot of good analysis on that show, except for the fact that he had Auburn to win the national championship. But I can't say anything either because I had Auburn in my Final Four. But he's a University of Dayton alumnus, right? And so we were at Charlotte for the Texas Colorado State game. And, we ended up watching the end of the Dayton game in the arena. And, so basically, like, they had like these tables set up around these TVs, like just in the lobby of the arena, right? So that's where you're watching it. And, people would walk by, and like when they were down double digits, they'd see his Dayton hoodie and be like, "Oh man, sorry." Or, they'd be like, they look at the TV and be like, "Yes, I had Nevada in my bracket." And then they see his Dayton shirt and be like, "Oh man, sorry about your team." And so then as Dayton started coming back, right? He starts getting into the game, we start getting into the game, and there starts to be people watching it with us. And, it ends up being almost like a little mini Dayton watch party as they're completing this comeback. And after they win, just, a lot of people randomly going hype over a Dayton game in the lobby of an arena. And then we very conveniently walked right up to our seats right as tip off of the Texas-Colorado State game, which was a blast as well. So just a real fun experience there that, the college basketball community, college basketball watching community, it's great to be a part of sometimes. Anyway, this game is going to be a pretty interesting one, in my opinion. So the most interesting part is I did not expect this to be the first game of the day. This game's being played in Salt Lake City. So 12:45 Eastern time is a 10:45 local tip. And I have a very unique perspective on this because when I worked for, or when I was at Charlotte, I worked for the football team in film. I broke down all the film for them and did a lot of other stuff as well in the office. But one thing I noticed about game day operations, it was very tough to have a normal game day operation for a noon kickoff for a college football team. So I can only imagine the difficulty and the oddity of this being a 10:45 a.m. tip-off for a college basketball team. Like, this just has to be a weird day to be that early local time. And so Dayton, with them being an East Coast team traveling west, I don't know how that's necessarily going to affect them. Will it still be 12:45 p.m. for their body clock? I don't know. For Arizona, it's definitely 10:45 a.m. for their body clock because they're used to being in the Mountain Time Zone. Now, what's interesting about this game, though, is that this is actually tied for the highest total on the slate, which is not something that you normally get with Dayton. KenPom has this game projected to be 79-73 in favor of Arizona. That 152-point total, like I said, is tied for the highest on the slate. It's not that reason because of Dayton. Dayton is one of the slowest teams in the nation, but it's not because of their lack of ability to score in transition. Is because their offense generally generates good looks at the end of shot clocks. They generally run action for a full 25 seconds before taking a good shot. If you watch them, they take very high quality shots. That's why they end up playing slow. And so if they're able to get a quicker shot earlier, they'll take it, but they generally will work that shot clock till they get a good look. Arizona, on the other hand, is not that. Arizona ranks 16th in the nation in tempo. So they're going to push this pace. They're going to give both offenses more possessions and more opportunities to score, which is going to drive this total up. But like I said, with the 10:45 a.m. local tip time, I don't know if this is going to get to 152 because that is definitely going to put a little bit of strain on their bodies. It's definitely going to be a different, preparation than they're used to. Now, for the Dayton squad, we got to talk about Deron Holmes. He's one of the highest priced players on the slate, and for good reason. He's one of the best players on the slate. He, against Nevada, ended with 38 fantasy points, which is pretty good for him. It's about 4x value. It's not like great, but it's not bad either. But also what's interesting is it was 38 fantasy points, and he tied for his season low in shot attempts with only 8 field goal attempts. So if you can get 38 fantasy points only taking 8 shots, to me, that's a really good sign for where his floor is at and where his ceiling is at, because what happens when he takes 17 shots? Or, even if you play him and he only gets 8 shots again and he puts up 38 fantasy points again, you're going to be okay with that. And against Arizona, the matchup against Umar Ballo, he's not exactly a fleet of foot big man. And so I really think Deron Holmes' athleticism and ability to stretch the floor is going to be key for this Dayton offense. They're going to run everything through him. In the game against Nevada, he still led the team in usage, even though he only took 8 shot attempts because they did try so hard to run their offense through. Now, what Nevada did that did kind of work a little bit is they were super physical with him off the ball. Every time he would set a screen, they would kind of grab him and hold him and try to muscle him around. Every time he posted up, they were sending doubles. They were just getting really physical with him, trying to get him out of rhythm. And it didn't really work all that much. It led to him not taking a whole lot of shots, but he was still very successful in the shots that he took. Now, Nate Santos, we've talked about, is the Holmes fade guy. Like, if you're going to not play Deron Holmes, it generally coincides with a Nate Santos ceiling game. Now, what's interesting in the Nevada game is they use Nate Santos to bring the ball up the court quite a bit. I don't necessarily know if that's going to be the case always, but what it led to for him was a lower number of field goal attempts than he's used to, but a really solid number of rebounds, and he put 3 assists as well. So if he's going to continue in that role, I got to think that that's going to play or bode well for him in fantasy, especially at $6,100. He only needs about 25 fantasy points to get to 4x. Now, Enoch Cheeks is probably the guard for them that I like the most, or I have the best feeling about. We've talked about him on the show before. He is a really solid guy when he gets aggressive for fantasy purposes. When he was at Robert Morris, he was a really high usage player, put up 15 points at about 5 boards a game, and he hasn't been that at Dayton because he hasn't had to be, but you can see the upside, right? Against St. Louis, 40 fantasy points, 15, 10, and 5. 14, 9, and 6 against VCU for 34 fantasy points. That's in him, right? And against Nevada, he had 12, 3, and 3, 4 for 8 from the field, 25 fantasy points. He can absolutely do that again, and there is a ceiling for higher. He's also the guard that tends to get the most peripheral stats for Dayton. So that's just another reason I like him, is he has multiple pathways to hitting value. Kobe Brea is probably your GPP play out of the Dayton guards, though. What's interesting is, reading up on their comeback from everything I've seen on the internet, basically at the under 8 timeout, when they were down 17, the guys in the huddle told him, hey, you got to shoot the ball more. And he did, and he hit like 3 or 4 threes during the run that Dayton had to make that comeback. And he is statistically the best three-point shooter in the nation on a percentage basis. But part of that is because he doesn't take a ton, and when he does take them, they're generally good shots. But he also has the ability to hit ones that are not good. He can hit some contested threes. And so if you see a game where he takes 10-plus threes, what is the fantasy ceiling going to be? Because against Nevada, he was 5 for 8 from behind the arc, put up 25 fantasy points. So let's say he just goes, 7 for 14, and that equates to about 30 fantasy points. Well, guess what? That's 5x value for a fantasy perspective. Javon Bennett is normally the starting point guard, but he came off the bench against Nevada. I think they were worried about his lack of size, and I don't know if that is going to be the case again here against Arizona. Isaac Jack is the direct backup to Deron Holmes. So if you want to do something super crazy and bet on Deron Holmes foul trouble, you can play Isaac Jack at 3,200. Against Nevada, he only played 8 minutes, but he did have 12 fantasy points in those 8 minutes. That's an insane rate. So if there ever were a Deron Holmes foul trouble situation, Isaac Jack would probably absolutely smash. Now, on the Arizona side, all 5 of their starters are above 6K on DraftKings, which makes them a lot harder to get to. It really does. Now, there is a pros and cons to that, though. The pros are all of them played a lot of minutes. The cons are now you're paying for it, right? So Caleb Love in that game against Long Beach State, where they won by 20, but it was never really like a super blowout where they just cleared the benches and let the walk-ons play for 5 minutes. So Caleb Love played 34 minutes in that game, 6 for 17 from the field, 48 fantasy points, 18, 11, and 5. Now, Caleb Love, we've seen him for, I believe, 5 years now, or maybe 4, maybe just 4, maybe 4 or 5, counting his time at North Carolina. And he's just an enigmatic guy, right? He's a very high ceiling player. He's a very low floor player. So, he had 48 against Long Beach, but the previous 3 games he had combined for 35.5. So you don't really know what you're going to get with Caleb Love. The 14 for 20 game is in there, but the 2 for 20 game is also in there as well. So I think he's purely a GPP play, but I liked him a lot more as a GPP play when he was sitting at 7,000 as opposed to 8,700. Now, Oumar Ballo is an incredibly steady fantasy option. And the reason why is because he doesn't need a lot of minutes or a lot of usage to put up a lot of fantasy points. He's averaging a double-double. So, he gets you that bonus routinely. He also blocks a lot of shots, gets a lot of steals as well. So he doesn't need the ball in his hands. He doesn't need to be on the floor quite a lot because he's able to put up stats at such a rapid rate. Now, on Thursday, he put up 39 fantasy points against Long Beach, only needed a 13% usage rate to do that, only needed 4 field goal attempts to do that. So Oumar Ballo, definitely a guy that possesses a really high floor, and, they're going to need him to guard Deron Holmes. And so the thing that worries me here is Deron Holmes is an elite foul drawer, and so if Oumar Ballo gets in foul trouble, then you're not going to want him in your lineup. And so I think that I'm looking at a situation where I would either want to play Holmes or Ballo. I don't think I would want to play both of them together in the same lineup. Now, Kylan Boswell was actually the team leader in usage and shots against Long Beach, played 33 minutes, took 19 shots, put up 43 fantasy points. But I'm not going to chase that. Generally speaking on this show, I don't like to tell you guys exactly what to do with your money. I don't like to tell you guys, oh, this guy's a terrible play or this guy's awful, never play him, he sucks. Like, I don't do that. But what I do is I research all the information. I absolutely grind out to get all the data and all the information. And I give you guys my interpretation of it in a way that is hopefully pretty digestible and pretty entertaining, and give you guys that information in what I'm going to do with it. Well, for Kylan Boswell, here's the information. He was great at the start of the season in these non-conference blowout type of games, right? And then against Long Beach, we have another blowout type of game against a team that's overmatched, and he puts up 43 fantasy points. In conference play, he was not that. So is the ceiling there? Yeah. Is he going to make my player pool? Probably not, because I'm not going to chase the ceiling game in a game that's not likely to be a blowout, and it's certainly not going to be played at the tempo that Arizona is used to. Now, Kashad Johnson, I do like a little bit, though. Oops, clicked on the wrong guy. So Kashad Johnson is a guy that I do like, mainly because Dayton, their one weakness all season long has been offensive rebounding, and Umar Ballo has about a 15% offensive rebound rate, and Kashad Johnson has about a 7% offensive rebound rate. They're a really good offensive rebounding team. So if Johnson's able to get some offensive rebounds, get you some putbacks, that is a really easy path to a lot of fantasy points, and I'm going to guess that he's probably going to play a lot of minutes in this one, given that it's going to be a pretty close game. So definitely like Kashad Johnson here on this slate. Pelly Larson is a guy I don't play a whole lot. He plays a ton of minutes. He's kind of just erratic with his stats. You never really know how many shots he's going to get, or even how many rebounds and assists he's going to get. So I don't really think he has a super high ceiling either. You know, in his last 5 games, he hasn't eclipsed 30 fantasy points. But if you go back farther, like he has a few games over 35 and a game over 50. But I don't know. I don't really play him a lot because he doesn't really hit his ceiling very often. So he's a guy I'm probably going to be ignoring, especially given the fact that it's a tempo down spot for Arizona going up against a slow-paced Dayton team. Now, for their bench guys, the only 2 that played significant minutes were Jaden Bradley and KJ Lewis. I would probably avoid all other Arizona bench options. Game number 2 is going to be Gonzaga versus Kansas. This one is also tied for the highest total on the slate, and it's projected to be 77-75 Gonzaga, according to KenPom. Now, for Gonzaga, they were a really interesting team in game 1 against McNeese. First off, they came out and they just blew the doors off of McNeese in the first half, and it wasn't even a game. But Anton Watson is the guy that led them in usage in game 1. He was really a mismatch in the way they used him against McNeese. They just didn't have an athlete that could match up with him. He had a 26% usage rate. He almost had a triple-double, 13, 13, and 9 for 46 fantasy points. That's a stat line I think you can go back to, because I think he's going to be in a similar situation again where I don't know if Kansas is going to have a matchup for him. It's probably going to be KJ Adams. As a big body 3, Ben Gregg at the 4, and Greg K at the 5. Well, in that game against McNeese, they kind of benched Ben Gregg in favor of Dusty Schromer, who played 18 minutes, or I'm sorry, who played 30 minutes and put up 18 fantasy points. Had my stats switched there. So 18 fantasy points for Dusty Schromer. He's absolutely a value that you can play at $4,000. There's not a whole lot of values on this slate. And at $4,000, you know, if he gets 30 minutes again, I think it's very likely that he gets the 4 or 5x value. So he's definitely a value that I'm going to be interested in. And then from there, Graham Ike is another guy that I like, just because, you know, he's generally a guy who doesn't play a ton of minutes, but he doesn't need a ton of minutes to score a lot of fantasy points, which is a good combination, right? He also generally leads the team in usage, but did not against McNeese. The only thing that concerns me against Kansas is Hunter Dickinson's ability to draw fouls. But if EK can stay out of foul trouble, he's going to be a pretty solid play, in my opinion. Nemhard is like the ultimate game stacking option. He excels in the peripherals, and, you know, super high assist rate, decent rebounder for a guard as well. So if you're looking to stack up this game and really think that it's going to shoot out, then Ryan Nemhard would be the guy that you would want to go with. Now, on the Kansas side, they're a really interesting team as well. So they played a super entertaining game against Samford on Thursday night, where they got to be gassed, because that game was up and down, up and down, up and down, a ton of possessions, a ton of running, and they didn't play a whole lot of guys. In fact, they only played 6 guys more than 3 minutes in that game against Samford. It was their starting 5 of Harris, Timberlake, Furphy, Adams, and Dickinson, with Elmarco Jackson coming off the bench. What's interesting, though, is that all 6 of those guys played and contributed. All 6 of those guys had between an 18% and a 18% and a 23% usage rate. The entire starting 5, so excluding Elmarco Jackson, scored 13 or more points. The entire starting 5 hit at least 4.5x value in terms of fantasy points or more. So it created, that game against Samford, it created a super solid environment for scoring fantasy points for the Kansas starting 5, when you're going to see a ton of possessions up and down the floor, and there's only going to be 6 guys playing. That's a recipe for fantasy goodness, right? Now, here's the problem. they got to be gassed, right? I don't know if you're going to be able to see them push the tempo, and play a game similar to what they did Thursday night, just because I don't know if they're going to have the legs to do it with the little depth that they have and the quick turnaround with it being 2 days. And also, I'm not a geography expert, but Salt Lake City's got to have a little bit of altitude, right? And somebody can look that up for me, but I'm not sure what the altitude of Salt Lake City is. I know it's not the same as Denver, but it's definitely not the same as playing at sea level. So this is going to be a pretty hard situation for these Kansas guys to really look to push the tempo given their lack of depth. Anyway, we did get a Hunter Dickinson ceiling game against Samford. They just didn't have a true center that could really handle him down low. And he ended up with 19 and 20 to go along with 5 assists, 4 blocks, and 2 steals. Just an absurd stat line. He's going to be going up against Graham Ike here in this one. And I think the one thing I do like going in Dickinson's favor is that he is going to have the length to be able to kind of get his hook shot over Graham Ike. Hunter Dickinson loves his hook shots, and if he's going up against a smaller guy, he's going to be able to get it off with regularity. So I do like that for him. But objectively speaking, I think I would rather play Deron Holmes at 9,300 than go to Hunter Dickinson at 9,600. KJ Adams was great in round 1 as well. 34 fantasy points on 39 minutes, 10 for 13 from the field. He's a guy that he's going to play a ton of minutes, and his usage is going to be pretty solid. I think he's a great cash game play. I don't know if he's going to ever have the ceiling to be a true GPP type of play. Furphy had 33 fantasy points, Harris 27 fantasy points, and Timberlake 29 fantasy points in the opening round. I think all 3 are in play. From a scoring perspective, I think Timberlake is the most natural scorer of the 3. He had 19 points against Samford. He was a supremely high usage player at his previous school, so I would be willing to go to him for that reason, just knowing that it's in the tank there somewhere and he just has to go down and get it. Game number 3 is going to be Michigan State taking on UNC. So this is going to be actually the first game I'm going to get to watch because this is the first game in Charlotte. I will be there for this one, and then Texas, Tennessee. This is not a great total, though. However, this is a really interesting spread. KenPom has it as UNC 72 to 69. Generally speaking, when 1 versus 8-9 games are that close in the spread, the 8-9 usually wins. Not saying it's going to happen, but the numbers in Vegas are not on North Carolina's side. To me, the eye test is on North Carolina's side. They look like a top-tier team. The numbers don't seem to think so, though. The numbers also really love Michigan State. Now, why might that be? Well, Michigan State ranks 6th in the nation in defensive efficiency and 310th in the nation in tempo. So this is not a recipe for a whole lot of fantasy points being scored on the Carolina side, going up against a really solid defense and a really slow tempo. Jaden Akins actually led the team in shot attempts in game 1. He was 6 for 14 against Mississippi State for 29 fantasy points. That's a pure ceiling game for Jaden Akins, though. He had only hit that total 3 times over the course of the season prior to that game. So I think that's kind of an unlikely outcome. Could you chase it? Yeah. Is it possible that he's just an NCAA tournament type of guy? Yeah, but I'm probably not going to go there. There's other guys on this team that I like better. Tyson Walker is normally their leader in shot attempts. He only took 12 against Mississippi State, but he still put up 33 fantasy points. To me, that says a lot about where Tyson Walker's floor is, that he played a game against Mississippi State that had a total of 120 points scored, only took 12 shots, which is low for him, and still put up 4x value. So Tyson Walker, definitely a guy that I like here on this slate. And I don't think he's going to be supremely high owned because I don't think a lot of people are going to click him with going up against this game environment. Now, what I do think is really interesting, though, is that when you look at usage rates, A.J. Hoggard and Malik Hall tied for the lead in usage rate. Malik Hall, we've talked about all season long, is a boomer bust, high ceiling guy. And it was not exactly his ceiling against Mississippi State, 15 fantasy points, but the usage was there. So if you're a usage rate truther, go back to Malik Hall. For A.J. Hoggard, we talked about on our show before Thursday's slate how his usage rate increased dramatically in the NCAA tournament last year. Well, guess what? It did again this year. The problem is it only translated to 22 fantasy points. However, if the usage is going to be there, I do think Hoggard makes for a very sneaky play. Now, Michigan State center, they started Carson Cooper, but he pretty much had a 50-50 split with Matty Sissoko. To me, this is almost just an unplayable situation. Neither of the two of them, nor Xavier Booker, nor Jackson Kohler, is playing enough minutes to hit 4 or 5x value. They would need an outlier game where they're the one that plays 25-plus minutes to hit that value. And given that they're going up against the human brick wall that is Armando Bacot, I don't think that this is a really likely scenario for one of the Michigan State centers to hit value. Now, on the North Carolina side, Armando Bacot is back to being Armando Bacot, y'all. He's had 40 fantasy points in 3 straight games. After his little bit of a slump in January and February, he is now back to being the double-double machine that we great in round 1, but he didn't really give a whole lot of peripheral stats. And for whatever reason, DraftKings on my laptop is really struggling to load right now. So he did not put up a whole lot of peripheral stats, which is kind of an issue when you play a fantasy points game, right? He only put up 2 rebounds and 2 assists, and so he only got to 31 fantasy points. He's going to need those peripheral stats if he wants to have a ceiling game. The problem is Michigan State is going to be a pretty good defensive team. They're going to slow the tempo down, so it's going to be harder for him to hit those peripheral stats. Between the two of them, I would much rather go up to Bacot. Harrison Ingram is the Bacot pivot, and I also think he has the best DVP matchup. He's going to be going up against Malik Hall, who we have seen guys score against this year and have really good games against him at the 4 spot against Michigan State. So I do think that this is a plus matchup for Harrison Ingram, and I'm absolutely willing to go to him for that reason. If you're worried about Bacot's ownership, then play Harrison Ingram, because when Bacot was in his slump, Harrison Ingram was having his best time of the season. Cormac Ryan is a 3-and-D guy. I think he makes for a great game stacking option, but this is not the best game to stack in the world. Elliot Cadeau is a freshman who has freshman tendencies. He's going to be boom or bust. You can maybe put him in a GPP lineup or 2, but just know that you never really know what's going to happen with Elliot Cadeau. And then the only bench guys that really did anything, even in a blowout game, were Jalen Withers and Seth Trimble. They were the only bench players who played double-digit minutes against Wagner, so those would be the only 2 bench players who I would be willing to roll with here on this slate, no matter who they're going up against. All right, y'all, so that is 3 games down. So I'm going to go ahead and clip the audio for the audio audience, and then I'm going to take a quick swig of my drink, and then we are going to get started with the next 3 games. All right, so game number 4 is Washington State and Iowa State. And if you thought that the North Carolina-Michigan State game was going to be bad to stack, boy, do I have news for you. This one's the worst one. KenPom has this one projected to be 68-62 in favor of Iowa State. That 130-point total is the lowest on the slate. And it's not even really all that close. Like, it's the lowest by about 10 points. '89 be for a lot of fantasy points. So if you were to play anybody from this game, who would it be? Well, I, for one, like Isaac Jones off of Washington State. He was the only player on their team in round 1 against Drake who had more than 20% usage. He had 42 fantasy points in that game. When they are committed to going into him inside, he has a super high ceiling. He's put up 40 fantasy points in 3 of the last 7 games. So definitely, I do think Isaac Jones is a guy that you can play probably as a one-off play here in this game. I'm probably not going to be stacking this game with 2 or even 3 guys on either side of it. So Isaac Jones is a guy that I definitely think you can play as a one-off. I do like Isaac Jones. Now, we've also seen some bigs have pretty good games against Iowa State this year. So definitely he checks a lot of boxes, but he's probably the only one on this Washington State team that does, in fact, check boxes. Miles Rice did have 20% usage. We talked about how in the postseason play, how he had upped his usage, but he didn't really shoot the ball particularly well against Drake. And if you can't shoot it well against Drake, how am I going to have any kind of faith that you're going to shoot it well against Iowa State? After that, Oscar Clough did have a 20% usage rate, but he only played 13 minutes. He did start, though, but he only played 13 minutes. What's interesting is 4 guys in this game played 35 minutes or more. So basically, Rice, Yakimovsky, Wells, and Jones were all on the floor for 35 minutes or more, and everybody else was just kind of rotating in that 5th spot. Isaiah Watts played 22 minutes off the bench, and the eye test told me that he was playing pretty good. Like, just me watching the game late last night, I'm like, wow, I feel like he is making some plays that are going to help them win this game. And he with 17 fantasy points. So he's definitely shown some upside over the last 5 games. He's had a 30 and a 28 fantasy point performance. He's also had a negative fantasy point performance. So you don't really know what you're going to get with Isaiah Watts, but like, you got to like the fact that he looked good and played 22 minutes in that game. I could definitely see them going back to him and giving him more minutes. Ruben Chinyello and Kamani Huzano are the other guys who played off the bench, but Huzano only played 9 minutes. Basically, Huzano's minutes went to Isaiah Watts once Isaiah Watts was playing well. On Iowa State, we talked about their two guards all season long, Lipsey and Gilbert. Well, against South Dakota State, Keshawn Gilbert led them in usage at 32%. He is now their usage leader on the season, officially, according to KenPom. He only put up 30 fantasy points, though. And Lipsey in that game put up 35 fantasy points on slightly less usage. So that's kind of interesting, right? But we've also seen Lipsey be really good in game environments where they're winning by a lot of points. That's generally where he is at his best. I don't necessarily think that that's going to be the case here in this one, but you know that the offense is going to be run by these two guards. And generally speaking, they combine for about 60 fantasy points a game. And in that game against South Dakota State, they only put up 65 fantasy points between the two of them. Now, granted, both of them got to 30, but 65 fantasy points between the two of them against a 15 seed. And now you're going to be going up against a super slow-paced, super good defensive team in Washington State. I don't really like the upside unless one of them were to have like a ceiling game. But the problem is if one of them's having a ceiling game, the other one's not going to be. Because like I said, they got about 60 fantasy points to go around between the two of them. So if one of them's going to get deforded, then you got to figure the other one's going to be down to 20. I just think it's a situation you can avoid. If I were to play anybody on this team, though, it'd probably be one of those two guys. Because the problem is the bigs, King, Jones, and Ward, they rotate them so much that it never really allows any of them to get a ton of fantasy points. King is the one who averages the most fantasy points per minute, but he only played 21 minutes against South Dakota State, only turned it into 18 fantasy points. Milan Momcilovic is a guy that I am a little bit interested in, though. He's played over 30 minutes in each of the last 3 games, 2 of which have been 29 fantasy point performances. He is a very shot-dependent guy, though. So if his threes are falling, look out. And I do think he gives a little bit of upside, and nobody ever plays him because he's always on Iowa State in these poor game environments. So I do think he's a guy you can't get to. And then Curtis Jones would be your Lipsey and Gilbert pivot. He comes off the bench. He's a very high usage player. Against South Dakota State, he put up 27 fantasy points in 28 minutes. So I would definitely be considering him as well. But I really think you can cross off this game entirely and be totally A-okay. I'm definitely not going to have any lineups that are stacks from this game. But if I were to play anybody, I would probably play Jones alone, Momcilovic alone, or either Lipsey or Gilbert alone. I think that really is – and maybe 1-1 both of those situations. So that's probably how I would be getting this game. But if you want to be super contrarian, you can stack it and hope that it shoots out. I just don't think that's very likely. Next game up is going to be Oakland taking on NC State. The battle of – I don't think you can classify NC State as a Cinderella, but the battle of the underdogs here in this one, right? For this game, I think NC State also, if you play any survivor pools, I think NC State is going to be the chalky survivor pick here on Saturday because they are an 11 seed who is favored. They're very unlikely to win their Sweet 16 matchup no matter who it is. So if you're playing survivor, I think everybody is going to pick NC State. So if you want to be different, pick somebody other than NC State. Now, KenPom has this game projected to be 77-70 in favor of NC State. For Oakland, Trey Townsend is their best player. He was the Horizon League Player of the Year. Wait, I think he was. Not 100% confident on that now that I think about it. But he's been their best player all year long, and they were the best team in the Horizon League all year long. And he led them in usage in round 1, had 15 field goal attempts against Kentucky, turned it into 45 fantasy points. And he was kind of the guy you had to have in the Survivor contest that DraftKings did. I didn't have enough of him. I really liked him as a play, but I didn't go all in on him, and I kind of should have, right? He put up 45 fantasy points. So he has a ton of upside, right? He's going to play every minute. He's going to get a ton of shots. He's going to get a ton of looks. He's a great rebounder. Can't say enough about how good of a play Trey Townsend is at 8,400. I think what you're going to see on this slate here on Saturday is I think you're going to see a lot of people start their roster at Trey Townsend at 8,400 and not really play anybody that's ahead of him, because I think there are concerns about everybody who's ahead of Trey Townsend. And so you can start your lineup at Trey Townsend with him as the most expensive guy. Now, what's really interesting is in that round 1 game, Townsend, Chris Conway, DQ Cole, and Jack Golke all played over 30 minutes in that game, with Blake Lampman and Rocket Watts playing 20-plus minutes. So let's go down the line here. So Jack Golke is the hero of March Madness, right? So like I said, I am not a guy who is going to tell you how to spend your money. But if you want to play Jack Golke for the vibes, go for it, right? Like it's almost like playing Tiger Woods in PGA DFS at the Masters, in my opinion. If you want to play him just because you want to root for Jack Golke, go for it. But I don't think that it's very likely that he sustains the performance against Kentucky. The good news is that he's playing a ton of minutes. The bad news is that now everybody knows about him. NC State is going to be all up in his grill guarding him, and it's unlikely that he's going to get 23-point attempts again. It's also equally unlikely that he's going to hit 10 again. So statistically speaking, I don't think it's likely that Jack Golke continues his run. But if you're a fan of fun and you're willing to spend your money on it, I don't mind playing him just if you want to root for Jack Golke, because it's a great story and he was great Thursday night and he's the face of March Madness right now. Now, Blake Lampman, like we talked about, played 28 minutes in game one. He generally is a guy who is pretty good from behind the arc, but when Golke was cooking, it led to Lampman not really cooking. So definitely a little bit of a push and pull there that I think if you want to fade Golke, Lampman can be a guy that you go with. DQ Cole was great in that game, 12, 8, and 4 for 29 fantasy points. Definitely a guy I think you can go back to as well. Rocket Watts is a guy we got to talk about as well. Michigan State transfer, did not play in the Horizon League championship game after getting hurt against Cleveland State. And he played 20 minutes against Kentucky and put up 16 fantasy points. That's a really solid fantasy points per minute rate for a guy who's $3,700. And with him being a Michigan State transfer, he's been in the NCAA tournament before. He's been here. He knows what he's doing. He's not going to be fazed by NC State or anybody that he's going up against. I really like the idea of playing him at 3,700 just as a nice veteran presence who can give them good minutes off the bench. Now, Chris Conway I skipped over, and it's for this reason. Townsend and Conway have, I think one of them has a really good game tomorrow. DJ Burns for NC State, we have seen be an absolute defensive liability at times this season. And if they play Burns a lot of minutes, he's got to guard one of them between Townsend and Conway. I would tend to think that he would guard Conway. And so that would give Conway a little bit of upside, which we've seen him have before. He had 30 fantasy points against Wisconsin and Milwaukee in the Horizon League championship game. So I do think that that's a situation you can target where you can play Townsend or Conway and just hope that you get it right on the one that DJ Burns is guarding. Speaking of DJ Burns, I don't want to pick on the guy, but he's been great for NC State in the postseason, right? You know, he pretty much tore up the entire ACC tournament. I had a 4-game stretch where he went 27, 22, 28, and 35 fantasy points. Then against Texas Tech, he got in first half foul trouble and only played 16 minutes and only put up 15 fantasy points. But here's the kicker with Burns, though. In those 16 minutes that he played, he had 50% usage. That is absurd. That means pretty much every possession he was in, over half the possessions he was in were ending with him with either a chance at an assist or a shot or a foul. That's wild. They really run their offense through him when he is on the floor. To me, that gives him a ton of upside if he is able to stay on the floor and stay out of foul trouble. I think he's purely a GPP play because you never really know what's going to happen. And I think he's got a little bit of Jack Golke in him as well, where he's just a super fun guy to watch and root for. So if you just want to play him for the vibes, I'm not going to be opposed to that either. Now, let's talk about the guys who did play a lot in that game against Texas Tech, though. So Mohamed Diarra, Michael O'Connell, DJ Horn, and Casey Morsell all played more than 30 minutes in that game. Diarra is an interesting one because he doesn't need a whole lot of usage to put up a lot of fantasy points. He's just a rebounding machine, and he's been great ever since about the start of the NCAA tournament, or the ACC tournament, I should say. 39, 52, 27, 41, 39 fantasy points in his last 5 so a 27-point floor. That's almost 4x. And he's done all that without ever having a high usage rate or ever really having a big time explosion in scoring. And so he's just grabbed double-digit rebounds every single game. So I do think that he's a pretty solid option for that reason. I do like DJ Horn a lot as well. He had over a 30% usage rate in that game against Texas Tech, 32 fantasy points. I think he is all the way back from his injury. And I think he's a guy who can put up stats in a variety of ways. Oakland gives up a historically high assist rate. And he did have 5 assists in that game against Texas Tech. So I do think DJ Horn is a pretty solid option. Another guy with a high assist rate is Michael O'Connell, who kind of runs the pseudo point guard for them. 15 fantasy points in 37 minutes against Texas Tech. He's going to be out on the court a lot. Great game stacking option. Can get you a lot of assists. And believe it or not, guess who also has a super high assist rate? DJ Burns. Yeah, it could be really interesting play to me. Now, After those guys, Ben Middlebrooks with the DJ Burns foul trouble had a ceiling game against Texas Tech, 35 fantasy points in 23 minutes. Look, if you want to fade DJ Burns, Ben Middlebrooks would be the guy to go with. Jaden Taylor has been great for this team all season long, but he's like almost out of the rotation now. So, in his last 4 games, he hasn't put up more than 13 fantasy points. So he's kind of a cross-off to me unless he can show that he's going to be a bigger part of this rotation. Next up, we have the Texas and the Tennessee game. This is the one I am looking the most forward to as a Texas fan. So this one, Ken Palm has projected to be 75 to 70 in favor of Tennessee. I don't think it's going to be that high scoring. Texas really played some defense against Colorado State. I don't think, there's a lot of jokes about Colorado State's offense, which are fair, but Texas played some serious defense. They forced a lot of contested shots. They forced a lot of turnovers. They forced a lot of the bad offense by Colorado State, as opposed to Colorado State just giving up, right? Now, in that game against Colorado State, somehow they only had 3 assists as the team. I think there was some sort of salty stat keeper or something, because watching it, I feel like they had to have more than that. Like they threw 3 lobs. So there had to be assists somewhere else, right? So I don't fully understand that one, but that really deflated a lot of the fantasy point totals for this Texas team against Colorado State. Now, in that game against Colorado State, Max Asmus and Tyrese Hunter were the only 2 that played over 30 minutes. You know the name Max Asmus, he's one of the previous heroes of March, right? He was not great against Colorado State, 5 for 15 from the field, but he can get hot at any time. He has a supremely high ceiling, and I know Tennessee is a great defensive team, but sometimes the way Asmus plays, defense doesn't even matter. He's going to make it anyway. So I really do like Max Asmus at his price tag on DraftKings of 7,300. He's been really cheap on FanDuel recently, so I do think he's an even more intriguing play over there. I have not seen the FanDuel salaries yet, though. Now, Dylan DeSue only played 24 minutes, and that 25 minutes DraftKings has it. 10 pump had is 24 against Colorado State. But in those 25 minutes that he played, he had a 43% usage rate. He took 18 shots. He was not good offensively, but he was great defensively, got you some boards. And it ended up not being an abject disaster with him getting to about 3.5x. But the usage is there and the opportunities are there that Dylan DeSue could absolutely turn in a ceiling game. The only problem is I think that Jonas Adu actually matches up really well with him. So I don't think that this is a particularly great matchup for Dylan DeSue. I will probably not be on him, but just know that the ceiling is there. Like the legitimate 50 fantasy point ceiling is there with Dylan DeSue if he does in fact get hot, because he does have that level of usage and he can contribute in ways more than just scoring. So definitely an intriguing play, not one that is super likely to have a but the ceiling is very high. Now, 2 guys I do have to shout out are Kendall Weaver and Brock Cunningham. They changed that game against Colorado State with their level of energy and effort on the defensive end, and Rodney Terry rewarded that with minutes. Brock Cunningham played at 18, only put up 14 fantasy points. He's just not a high-usage offensive player. Kendall Weaver was, though. Kendall Weaver played 29 minutes in that game and had 18 fantasy points. So I do think Kendall Weaver, he's probably going to be the guy for Texas who's going to be asked to guard Dalton Knecht. And Dalton Knecht doesn't draw a whole lot of fouls. So I do think there's an opportunity for Kendall Weaver to play 30-plus minutes in this game because of his defense. And he's a good enough offensive player that he can put up a ceiling performance and give you pretty good value at a salary of $5,000. Caden Shedrick would be your direct pivot off of Dylan DeSue. He played a lot of minutes against Colorado State because DeSue was in foul trouble. Tyrese Hunter and Dylan Mitchell are really hard to figure out. They're really talented. The fantasy performances are all over the place. The usage is all over the place. Ceiling is there, but I don't think it's anything you can really rely on. And then Ithiel does start for Texas still, played 16 minutes against Colorado State, only put up 7 fantasy points, was 0 for 2 from the field, but did grab 7 boards. You would need him to play a lot more minutes in order to hit value, and a lot of those minutes went to Kendall Weaver like we already talked about. Now for Tennessee, they're a pretty interesting team. They were not tested in round 1 against St. Peter's. They just weren't. They didn't really have to play a good game to win that game. They didn't have to go all out to win that game. So I don't really know what to make of it. Knecht, Ziegler, and Adu were the only double-digit scorers for that team. And I think that the logic that I've held on Tennessee is going to hold for this game as well, where if I'm playing Dalton Knecht, I'm only going to play Dalton Knecht, because a lot of his buckets are scored in isolation, and that makes it really hard for other guys to score a lot of fantasy points. If I'm not playing Don't Connect, I can go Ziegler and Adu. I could go Ziegler and James. I could go James and Adu. I could go Adu and Vescovi. Like, I can go with a lot of different options with combinations of guys. But the other guys elevate each other when they're playing well because, like, Zakai Ziegler, he had 10 assists against St. Peter's, 32 fantasy points. Like, the assist rate is considerably higher for every other guy. And they'll grab rebounds as well. So, given the fact that they can give you a lot of those peripherals, I would rather pair the other four guys with each other or just play Connect. That's going to be the same logic that I'm going to hold for this Tennessee team until they show me otherwise. All right, so that was, excuse me, that was game number 6. And so we have got 2 games to go. I'm going to go ahead and clip the audio for the audio audience. And then we're going to get started with the last 2 games. Sorry. StreamYard does not make it really easy to mute my mic if I have to cough like that. Can you tell that my voice is a little bit gone from all the loud cheering at Texas Thursday night? So I'm hoping that I still sound okay here on the podcast, but definitely takes a little toll out of your voice to be in an arena yelling for 2 hours. So anyway, we got 2 games left. So if there's any play that you want me to talk about that we haven't talked about yet, that you got thoughts on, put it in the chat. Let's get some discussion going. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I'm here to give you guys the information. I'm not here just because I like doing this for myself. If I was, I would keep all the information to myself. But I'm here for you guys to help you guys build these winning lineups tomorrow. So if there's any questions you have, anybody you want me to talk about, please let me know in the chat. Also, while you're there, if you like what we're doing here on the channel, please hit the like button on the video. Please subscribe to the channel. We're closing in on 500, and I really do want to hit that milestone before the NCAA tournament ends. All right, so game number 7 is going to be Duquesne taking on Illinois. And this is the biggest contrast of styles that I think I've seen on an NCAA tournament slate in a while. And that's saying something because there were a few big contrasts of styles on the Thursday and the Friday slate. Well, for Duquesne, they rank 252nd in the nation in tempo and 29th in defense. They're really slow. They're not a good offensive team, but they will lock you up. Illinois plays at the 59th ranked tempo in the nation, and they're 92nd on defense. So they're going to get up and down. They're going to score a ton of points, and they're going to be okay if you score because they know they can outscore you. That's a pure contrast of styles. And KenPom has it ending as a 150-point total, which is pretty high in my opinion. They have it projected to be 80 to 70 in favor of Illinois. Now, for Duquesne, if they're going to get to 70, that really makes me like the chances of Jimmy Clark and Day Grant. So they're their 2 best players. They will take a lot of contested shots. They're going to take a lot of tough shots, and they're going to have a ton of usage. In that game against BYU, they were the only 2 starters who were above 20% usage, and they generally combined for about 57 fantasy points. And in that game against BYU, Jimmy Clark had 28, Day Grant had 29. Guess what that adds up to? 57. So I do think that the Illinois matchup is going to allow them to combine for a little more than 57 points, just given the general pace and the general lack of defense. So I would not be super opposed to pairing them together, especially because they contribute in different ways. Grant is closer to a pure scorer. Jimmy Clark is more of a pure peripheral stats guy. So I don't mind playing 1 or 2 of Clark and Grant here in this one. They're going to be the guys with the ball in their hands. That if Duquesne gets to 70, the 2 of them are probably going to combine for 35 at least. Now, what's also interesting is there were 2 more guys who played 30-plus minutes in the game against BYU. Jake DeMichael was one of them. We've talked about him before. He hasn't been great from a fantasy perspective, but you're getting a guy at $4,700 who is going to play 30-plus minutes, who is going to take 6 or 7 shots. He can get you some boards, get you some assists. I don't think he's a terrible option, especially in a very pace-up matchup against Illinois. I don't think he's a bad game stacking option either if you just want to get another piece from this game. So Jake DeMichael is definitely a guy who is going to make some of my lineups, but I don't think he's reliable enough for me to consider him a core play or anything like that. Now, Jacob Nechas is how the announcers were pronouncing it, was also a guy who played 30 minutes against BYU. He did it off the bench, and he put up 27 fantasy points. He was like the value play of the slate on Thursday, because he came in at a salary of $3,100 and he gave pretty much 7x value, which was outstanding. It was one of the first games of the day, and if you had him, you were feeling really good about your lineup for the rest of the day. So now he's up to $3,900, and I'm still willing to play him, because if he's going to get 30 minutes, then he's going to have an opportunity to put up 20 plus fantasy points, which would be 5x value. Now let's talk about why he played 30 minutes though. So Trey Williams was out Thursday, and I believe he's going to be out again. They haven't really revealed much at all about his injury, but what they did was they moved Fousseyni Drame and David Dixon into the starting lineup. Drame only played 16 minutes. He was in foul trouble. He had 4 fouls and ended with 17 fantasy points, which is not terrible for a guy in the 5K range. David Dixon played 26 minutes. Dealt with not as much foul trouble, but ended with 22 fantasy points. So because Williams was out and Dixon and Drame were not super effective high-minute players, that allowed Nachas to come in and give a ton of minutes and put up a ton of fantasy points. So I think that if you play Nachas, you definitely want to avoid Drame and Dixon, because if he plays well, it's going to come at the expense of those two guys. So I think if you're using any kind of optimizer and putting in a rule, I would want to get at most one Duquesne forward between Nachas, Drame, and Dixon. However, the guards, like I said earlier, I think you can combine 2 or maybe even 3, if you're feeling really funky, of those guards between Clark, Grant, and DeMichael. And the reason you can do that is because Illinois is going to really get up and down. Illinois wants this game to be played at a breakneck pace. Also, what Illinois wants is they want to get their 2 main guards going. And those are Terrence Shannon Jr. and Marcus Damask. In that game against Morehead State, Terrence Shannon Jr. had 26, 2, and 4, 43 fantasy points on a 28% usage rate. And then Marcus Damask had a triple-double and put up 45 fantasy points on a 27% usage rate. So here's what I like about these two. I generally have not played these two together all season, but in the postseason, so much of the Illinois usage has been concentrated around these two guys that you can absolutely play them together. I like Domask a little more though. To me, he just has a wider pathway to putting up fantasy points and hitting value because of how much he puts up in the peripheral stats. He's basically running the point guard right now for Illinois, which has increased his assist rate. You've seen him put up at least 8 assists in each of the last 3 games. So at $8,500, I really do like him just because of the wide path that he gives for putting up a lot of fantasy points. Now, Coleman Hawkins did play over 30 minutes in that game against Morehead State. He tends to excel in games where he kind of has a mismatch, and I don't really know if he does against Duquesne. I mean, we've seen Deron Holmes eat Duquesne alive, but Deron Holmes eats a lot of teams alive. So I don't really know what to make of Coleman Hawkins. He hasn't had a ceiling game in quite a while. I think he would be an interesting GPP play and just hope that you catch lightning in a bottle. What's also interesting for Illinois is that, those 3 are always going to play a ton of minutes. But it had previously been Ty Rogers and Dane Danger, Ty Rogers and Quincy Guerrier, who were playing a lot of minutes as the supporting cast. But against Morehead State, it was a Dane Danger and Luke Goody game. Dane Danger, he played 23 minutes and put up 35 fantasy points. He can do that because he's a super high usage player when he's on the floor. You just never know how long he's going to be on the floor. I think now he's a little bit of an overpriced GPP upside play. If he were about 4,500, I would be super interested. But at 5,600, he's got a very narrow pathway to hitting fantasy value at $5,600, right? Because you think about it. He's got to hit 22 fantasy points just for 4X, which 4X has not been enough to cash either of the last 2 days. And to get those 22 fantasy points, he's going to have to play at least 15 minutes, which he doesn't do all the time. So, we talk about Marcus Damask having a wide pathway to reach fantasy points. Well, Dane Danger has like a balance beam to reach his ceiling. And I just don't think that it's super likely that he gets there. Now, on to the last game of the day, which is going to be between Oregon and Creighton. KenPom has this one projected to be 77-71 in favor of Creighton. For Oregon, they're one of the hottest teams in America right now. Nafali Dante has been over 35 fantasy points in every game this month. He has been super impressive, in my opinion. He blocks a lot of shots. He's a great rebounder. He's super long, super athletic, and he doesn't need a whole lot of usage to put up a lot of fantasy points, which makes it really nice. But he is $8,800. So you do need him to put up a lot of fantasy points. He did have a 30% usage rate in the last game against South Carolina. It was a great match for him going up against BJ Mack, who just cannot match his athleticism. Now, with Nafali Dante, everybody thinks that Ryan Kalkbrenner is a bad matchup for centers. And for some centers, that's the case. But Dante is every bit as big and long as Kalkbrenner is, and I think he's actually more athletic. And Kalkbrenner doesn't draw a ton of fouls, so if Dante stays out of foul trouble, he can actually give you a pretty solid performance here in this one. I'm not super scared of the Ryan Kalkbrenner matchup. Now, Jermaine Couisnard was one of the stories of the tournament on Thursday. Putting up 40 against the school he transferred from in South Carolina, and for 58 total fantasy points. He was a GPP winner on Thursday, for no better way to say it. He had a 38% usage rate in that game. And 22 shots has not been out of the ordinary for him. Like, he has taken at least 16 shots in every game in March. So pretty much Oregon, with their time being on this run that they're on, Couisnard and Dante have been great in every game, pretty much. And so I think you can go back to one of the two of them. I think against Creighton, it's going to be pretty hard for both of them to hit value, but I definitely think you can go back to one of them here in this game and trust that they're going to continue on this heater that they've been on. Now, no other player that played for Oregon after Dante and Couisnard was over a 17% usage rate against South Carolina. That just makes it really tough for those guys to hit value. But the good news is that there's three of them that are playing a ton of minutes. Jackson Shellstat, 37 minutes against South Carolina, 21 fantasy points. And he does have, when you look at his game log, a history of being able to get the 5x value. Kwame Evans Jr. played 29 minutes, put up 23 fantasy points against South Carolina. And then Jadrian Tracy played 30 minutes, put up 15 fantasy points against South Carolina. Now, those are not great numbers, but South Carolina plays at a super slow tempo. And so that might have deflated those a little bit. And you got to feel like Creighton's not going to let Dante and Couisnard beat them like South Carolina did. So I do think that the supporting cast for Oregon does have a little bit of interest from me. For Shellstat, Evans, and Tracy, if they do play that many minutes, there's definitely a chance that they could end up hitting value. Now, Creighton, my opinion on them is pretty much the same now as it was like December of last season, because it's pretty much the same setup. Here's what I mean by that. They play four guys a ton of minutes: Baylor Sharman, Ryan Kalkbrenner, Trey Alexander, Stephen Ashworth. They're all great. They're all really good at basketball, and they all play really well together. But they're really hard to target in DFS because they are really overpriced. They're priced for their ceiling, and not all of them ever have a ceiling game at the same time. And so it's really hard to roster it's really hard to roster more than one of that Creighton Big Four. It's just a simple fact of the matter. The fifth guy on the floor is either going to be Miller or Farabello, and they pretty much, when they're on offense, just stand in the corner, and if they're passed to it, they take the open three. If not, they just run back on defense and they try to get a rebound, and then they run right back to their corner. So I'm not really super interested in playing those guys for that reason. But I think if you're looking to play somebody from Creighton, it's got to be one guy out of the Big Four, and my pick would be Baylor Sharman. He's been an elite level rebounder. He can really score the basketball. He doesn't need a ton of shot attempts to get there. He's probably my favorite of the Creighton guys, even though he is the most expensive of the Creighton guys. But objectively, he's sitting here at 9,300. Like I said, all these Creighton guys are priced for their ceiling. I think I would rather play Deron Holmes at 9,300 than Baylor Sharman at 9,300. And like I said earlier, I don't think a whole lot of people are even going to touch these guys that are above 8,400, because you got Trey Townsend sitting there at 8,400 as a really solid pay up option. And so I really think it might be contrarian this week to go up above Townsend and play two guys that are above him. I think that's going to be a super contrarian build. And really, I think Damask might be the most popular of all the ones that are up there, coming off the triple-double, coming in at the salary of only $8,500, whereas Terrence Shannon Jr. is $600 more expensive. That's just my anticipation of it. And so that's one early way I think you can look at building a lineup is, if a lot of people are going to be starting at Townsend, I can definitely be a little bit different if I go get one or even two guys above Trey Townsend. And like we talked about with all of these games, there's definitely enough value here on this slate that you can go up and get some of these guys up top if you want them, and then backfill it with value. We talked about Rocket Watts. We talked about Isaiah Watts, ironically, and then Nachos for Duquesne. I feel like there's another one that I'm missing, but maybe it'll come back to me. But there's definitely plenty of options for value on this slate that you can get to. All right, so that does it for the 8 games that are going to be played on Saturday. I will hang out here a little bit longer. If you guys have any questions, want to talk about any specific play, want to talk about the tournament so far, or anything else, I'm here. And if you guys want to discuss anything, put it in the chat. If you want more from me for this Saturday slate or the Sunday slate or any in advance, make sure you join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description. And also make sure that you follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. If there's ever any updates for the show, I will be putting them on there. And then if there is ever any, anything else that I need to get out, I usually do get it out on Twitter. That if you ever have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer on Twitter. And then also I do write a full article for every college basketball DFS slate where I profile all my core plays as well as my lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. I post them to my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. So if you heard all this information and want to know who actually makes my lineups, that is where you can get that information. All right. So with that being said, we went a little longer than I expected, clocking in at almost an hour now. But definitely do think we got a lot of good information out there. I hope we gave you guys plenty of information that is going to help you guys win on the Saturday slate. I know I really enjoyed it. Remember, like we said earlier, there will be no live show or recorded episode for Sunday because tomorrow I'm going to be traveling back to Charlotte to watch the Texas game, and there's just no time in there for me to do it. I'm going to be getting back at like midnight, and it's just not a good situation. So if you do want my thoughts on the Sunday slate, make sure you head on over to the Fantasy Corner Discord because I'm going to have my full game notes available in there. So if you want to see all the information that I would normally get out here on a podcast, the game notes will have that, and they will be in the Fantasy Corner Discord exclusively. All right, so that does it for this episode, guys. Hopefully your bracket is still intact. Hopefully your DFS lineups are caching. And hopefully tomorrow we just gave you guys plenty of information that's going to keep that up as well. Before you go, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Help me out. I'm closing in on 500 subscribers. I want before the end of the tournament, and that can only happen if people like you hit that subscribe button. So please do that for me if you have not already. And then also please like the video. It helps the channel get noticed, helps the videos get noticed, helps me out a ton. And I really do appreciate it when you guys do that. I cannot stress enough how much it helps. All right, so that's going to do it for me, guys. Yeah, that pretty much does it. Best of luck to you guys on the Saturday slate. Reach out to me if you have any questions, need anything. I'm more than happy to help, more than happy to share the information that I have grinded to work on. With that being said, guys, best of luck on the Saturday slate. Thank you guys for watching to this point, and I will see you guys next time.